you have the. Okay, great. Okay, let's start.
Yeah, okay. For those of you that were expecting a meetup last week, I apologize for falling down on the job. For some reason or other, I completely forgot to post it. So then I posted this week. So I'll catch up. Right after we're done here, I'm going to post next week's meetup. So it's kind of hard to summarize the first four sections. Well, it's not really hard. It's Nietzsche's sort of setting up what he's going to actually make more explicit in sections 5 through 8. And so in section 5, he's setting Schopenhauer up as a kind of Platonic ideal of what a philosopher ought to be and how a philosopher ought to live as well. And he's going to develop these themes. And Nietzsche is almost specific about the Platonic ideal. Generally speaking, what's happening here is he's attacking the culture of Germany at the time, which I think reflects an awful lot of the culture that we have here in America today, too, and possibly around the world. I don't know very much about other cultures. And setting up a description of why Schopenhauer is a kind of human being. In fact, he's identifying Schopenhauer as one of the human beings, as opposed to what he refers to as just animals, basically. And it's not a derogatory term the way he's using it. He's just pointing out that human beings are animals to begin with, but we have a gift of being able to imagine metaphysical beginnings. And the person who, well, basically, he's the true human beings are the philosophers, the artists, and the saints. And so I'm wondering what you guys think about that as a concept to begin with. If nobody participates, we might as well just call the whole thing off and move on to the next one. So I need your participation. I'm not going to just lecture for the whole hour. No comments at all on what I just proposed.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Someone interrupted me.
Well, no, well, I was just sort of saying that Nietzsche is distinguishing philosophers, saints, and artists as the truly human beings. He italicized that specifically. And I was just wondering what any of you thought about that notion. Distinguishing, referring to other people as animals. Yeah, thanks, Martin. Without using that in a derogatory way, just mentioning that getting through your day, eating, going to work, doing all is not all that different from what animals do. And human beings in his sense have a higher purpose carved out by nature. So there's a very important streak of Darwinism at work here. So I'm just throwing that out as some way to start the conversation. Geneva, you're almost 10 minutes late, so please try to be on time, would you?
Oh, sorry. My computer, I don't know, something went wrong with the meetup site. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Nobody has any comments at all? Because if you don't, I don't know quite what to do here. This is a discussion group. James.
Yeah, well, he's saying that human beings are distinguished from animals because we have some more possibilities of experiencing life in terms of philosophical experiences. But I think he's distinguishing that kind of philosophical experience.
Your sound is really bad. James,
Plato's idea of,
James,
is it down? Okay, sorry.
your sound is really bad.
Yeah.
Can you get closer to your
Is it bad?
microphone?
Okay, yeah. So can you hear me now?
I could hear you before, but it was breaking up a lot, so you might have a bad
All right.
connection.
Yeah, sorry. So it's distinguishing himself, Schopenhauer from someone like Plato, because Plato, of course, was a philosopher, but he was represented this kind of aesthetic idealism, whereas Schopenhauer maybe is more of a philosopher who is, for him, not just fixated on a particular ideal, but embracing the creative life process.
I think that he holds Plato in pretty high esteem. Actually, he may argue with some of his points, but I don't think he's distinguishing that Schopenhauer is any way better than Plato necessarily. It's these kinds of thinkers, these kinds of people who actually try to understand what life's potential is and to face the real reality and the truth of their times and themselves. And Schopenhauer was just the classic example, because he was very enamored of Schopenhauer anyway, which you pointed out in the first part of the essay. That as soon as he read Schopenhauer, he was immediately attracted to him, because Schopenhauer was saying things that he found himself congenial with. Well, let me just throw a whole question out. What did you guys think of the last part of the essay? I think there's a lot of stuff going on here that will be important later on, especially the philosopher, saint, artist ideal that he's setting. And a little bit later on, I might need a handout. I don't see any hands. James.
Yeah, I think he saw he distinguished between different kinds of philosophers. Those who represented the interests of the state, and that they were paid philosophers who worked for the state. But those for him are not the real philosophers. They were not just academics at the subordinate to the interests of the state. And so maybe that's perhaps why I felt that his attitude toward Plato was something like that. That Plato was more in line with the interests of the state.
Well, Plato tried to do that, and that was a big mistake. But Plato's thinking was to imagine the possibilities. And in the Republic, he came up with a lot of possibilities. And by focusing on Socrates, he brought Socrates to a brand new kind of life. I really don't think that he thinks that Plato isn't a good philosopher. His attack on the university scholarship and the sponsorship of the universities, I think is right on target. And I've wondered about that a little bit myself. So I found myself really congenial with that particular chapter, because I had one of my best friends just from UCLA, and he was a professor of the philosophy of science. And we get into a lot of philosophical discussions. But one of the things that became apparent, because I've known this guy for a long time, is his disdain for university philosophy himself. So a lot of what Nietzsche's attack is in Section 8 is as relevant today as it was back in the day. Just because you have a degree in philosophy doesn't mean you are a philosopher. And that was the case with my friend. My friend never philosophized. What he did was he learned what predecessors have had to say about science and what is it for and all the rest of it. And he absorbed it and regurgitated it to his students. And finally had enough, because it was the same kind of lectures all the time. The level of curiosity and involvement in the students was negative for the most part. Very, very few people showed up. They were hiring people at UCLA for reasons other than the work they were doing in philosophy. And so that was, I don't philosophize myself. I hardly ever sit around. There are a few things that I've come up with, running over some of the things, a lot of things that Nietzsche said down the road, when we get down the road a little bit, very provocative thoughts, but it's not something that, even though I have lots of time, that I do. And I think the criticism of the university is relevant today as it was when he wrote it. Jason.
Yeah, I got his criticized philosophy part, but I still don't get his connection with Schopenhauer. Only thing I can think about is Schopenhauer talk about the will. So will is important for Nietzsche. That's the thing I can think about. But I seems he didn't mention in these essays. So one thing is possible is you just mentioned. Schopenhauer is a little bit different than other philosophers, So.
Well, Schopenhauer was not an academic. I pointed that out last time. And there was so much originality in Schopenhauer's concept of the world as will and representation. And Nietzsche was very struck by that. And he felt that Schopenhauer was a genius. And what he does examine about Schopenhauer is how he was raised and how he lived and how he thought. And he was independent. Well, he had money. He didn't have to work. He disdained the university. And he still worked at philosophizing. And this is the example, I think it's in section 7, where he lists all of the things that made Schopenhauer be Schopenhauer. It allowed Schopenhauer to grow and develop his thoughts. And that kind of nurturing is what Nietzsche is trying to pitch in the new proposed culture that would come afterwards, a culture that would nourish people who could be great artists. He doesn't get into anything about how do you find these people in the first place. So that's the big lacunae in the argument in a way, but he's just taking Schopenhauer as an example. And the educator part of it is not just the philosophy, but the way he lived his life.
So he's not talking about the book Schopenhauer wrote of the world as a will and the representation. He's talking about Schopenhauer as a person.
As a person.
Okay. I think that's a big misunderstood, big presumption I read. That's why I kind of find out, mismatch when I read it.
I think it's
because I missed the previous section. So can you talk a little bit about the man of Rousseau, the man of Goethe, and the man of Schopenhauer?
These were examples of philosophers and writers, artists, Goethe especially. Goethe is virtually the Shakespeare of Germany. Goethe was a standard, and part of the standard for Nietzsche was the way Goethe lived his life. Goethe lived for his art. He thought that art was the highest. Dramatic poetry, there's that quote from Goethe that dramatic poetry was the highest form of human expression. And so he thought Rousseau was an example of how to live a life, not just the philosophy. And Goethe was the artist example, and Schopenhauer was another philosopher. I was going to say philosophical example. He doesn't explore the notion of a saint, and he has a curious thought about the saint, and I know this will play a larger role later on. When we were reading the Birth of Tragedy, the Dionysian spirit was a loss of individuality and an immersion in the commonality of the entire community of human beings and losing your own identity. And the way he describes the saint, well, here I wrote the note I took and the three things. The philosopher sees the truth. Philosophers see the truth. And artists express the truth. And saints transcend the truth and live beyond. It's really not so much what they think and do, although that's a big part of it. If Schopenhauer hadn't written what he wrote, Nietzsche would not think him as highly, consider him as highly. He thinks that he's a genius as a philosopher, and that it's a very rare person that comes along that way. And Goethe was just nationally renowned as this great artist and poet, a novelist, and a man who lived outside of his time. Goethe was bigger than his time. And these are the examples that Nietzsche is trying to propose as the end goal of human life on the planet, as far as nature is concerned. And nature seems to take on a kind of godlike role, but there's nothing supernatural about it. It's a natural process. And that's something else I think that's worth remarking on and staying with, because Nietzsche is going to develop this theme as time goes by. So there was a bit, I try to just say, let's just stay in the time zone so we don't know what's coming down the road. But in Ecce Homo, which was his virtual biography at the end of his life, in commenting on Schopenhauer's Educator, he said, it's really Nietzsche as Educator. And so Nietzsche is setting himself up as an example. He was like 30, 31 years old at this point, and was consumed with philosophy and tried to live the philosophy that was another point that he makes. I forget which section it is necessarily, but it's not, philosophy is not just something you sit around in a chair and think about. It's a way to live. And a philosopher, a true philosopher, should be able to live that philosophy in at least his thinking. So I don't know where else to go with that. So that was his reflection on Schopenhauer's Educator. Well, let me take a couple of quotes here and see what anybody thinks. His mission appears to be to sort out what it would take practically to produce this goal of having a culture, a society that nurtures and encourages the geniuses among us who are rare and special, but represent the best that human beings can be. And so here's one thing: all nature presses towards man. It thereby intimates that man is necessary for the redemption of nature from the curse of the life of the animal, and that in him existence at last holds up before itself a mirror in which life appears no longer senseless, but in its metaphysical significance. And the metaphysical part is nature wants great human beings. Usually we fail to emerge out of animality. We ourselves are the animals whose suffering seems to be senseless. And I don't know anybody that might not identify or at least recognize what he's saying there. Haste is universal because everyone is in flight from himself. So the goals are honesty, truth-seeking, and self-awareness, the willingness to look at yourself in more than just a mirror. And Nietzsche spent his entire life doing this, and that's where a lot of the philosophy is actually coming from. And it's interesting too, I might have mentioned this earlier, that Nietzsche himself was an academic. And so he understood the university life. His first job was a professor of philology at the University of Basel. And he became too ill through, well, who knows what cause, but he became very sick and eventually received a stipend from the university for the rest of his life. And that was what he lived on. So anybody got any comments at all on what I just read? Or am I talking to myself here?
Well, those things that you mentioned, the honesty, truth seeking, looking at self, are the things that most people don't do. Lots of people are pointing fingers at scapegoating,
Yeah.
trying to find some reason or excuse outside themselves for why things are happening the way they're happening. And so I think he's right in those things. But that's just my own personal opinion. But I think that most of the world do not think this way. And that's partially problematic. In like the politicians and the people who are supposed to be running things. And I think I again read the wrong section, because the section that I read was on history. I don't know how I keep getting it wrong, but
You never read this essay at all?
yeah, but I just the 5 through 8, no.
Okay, no, all right.
But
We'll keep
but
going.
I mean, what's that?
We'll keep going. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I think I could comment based on the little I do know about Nietzsche, about certain things. And I think that's kind of what's happening in society. Well, maybe it's always been this way, but specifically because I'm living in this period, I can see this now.
Well, I think part of what he's observing I think some authentic truths here. And when Walter Kaufmann wrote his it's hard to say, his analysis of Nietzsche's philosophical history. I lost it. Oh, he called him psychologist, philosopher, psychologist, antichrist, because Nietzsche came before Freud, and Freud did read Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is an amazing psychologist in a way, and this is just an observation. And again, I think it's just an observation. I don't think he's being critical. He's just observing how many things can get in the way of people's lives, especially if you have to work for a living. Then you're caught in a trap of some kind. Martin.
Yeah, I feel like, maybe the Uberman was something of the past as well. I kind of agree with Geneva there, where like people back in the day, they had to be really self-reliant, right? Whereas it seems like now people are really dependent on society, government, AI, robotics, and so forth to get that, perfection, I guess, or become that, perfect Uberman. But I feel like, the mind, the brain, there's so much there on the inside that we aren't exploring as much anymore. Certain people, of course, not everyone, right? But I feel like we're focusing too much more on like creating that Uberman outside of ourselves rather than inside.
Well, we're not to the Uberman yet. We don't know anything about the Uberman.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
No, that's
But
okay.
like, I guess,
This is your
yeah.
first time here, so
Yeah.
but that's the thought here, is to see how Nietzsche develops his thinking as we go through the books. So we won't get to the Ubermensch until Zarathustra. And we are going to do Zarathustra, by the way. I decided that that's a necessary part of this whole thing. Jason.
I think he has a hint of Uberman, right? Here he talk about the scent. You haven't read this part yet in chapter 5, but in section 5, to promote the production of the philosopher, the artist, and the scent within us and without us, and thereby to work at the perfecting of nature. I think that's the same chapter. And you just explained the scent. Philosopher is truth seeking, and artist as truth expression, and the scent is truth transcendenting or something. Okay, so he probably has a hint on Ubermensch, but not developed yet.
Well, in fact, no, he hasn't got to the Ubermensch yet. Let's not even
But
go there.
I like to comment here is, seems like he haven't, in this moment, he haven't think about himself as a philosopher. He kind of critique on the modern culture. Okay, so I just at least I probably don't see himself as a philosopher. He kind of like criticize the situation in the college, in the education, and the German education. I think it sounds like he haven't think about himself as a philosopher. You know, that's my feeling.
Yeah, he's more of a cultural critic and polemicist here, and especially in the beginning. I have a feeling, though, that especially what comes out of this particular essay is that he's really starting to sense himself as somebody who might be a philosopher as well, and so that's why he's setting up this example of Schopenhauer later claiming, spoiler, that it's actually a description of himself. So I think we can take it for granted, especially after these untimely meditations. His turn to philosophy is deep. He's philosophical from here on out. Geneva.
I was just looking at this section here where he's talking about Kant, and he's saying that Kant may be a genius, but he's not really. Is he saying that he's not really a philosopher because he's in some chrysalis stage and he never breaks through that chrysalis to these? I think probably these three things that you mentioned just before. I mean, I don't know Kant. I've not read Kant, but I'm imagining that unless, at least from Nietzsche's perspective, if you're not doing these three things that you just mentioned, that you're not a philosopher and you're still in that infant stage. He doesn't. Well, I don't know if he does because I didn't read the all of the sections, but I don't know if he's mentioned Dostoevsky because he's a big fan of Dostoevsky and said that Dostoevsky was the best, not philosopher, but psychologist that he had read.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I think we'll get more observations about Dostoevsky down the road. Right now, this is not.
Okay.
Right now, the focus is basically, in this essay in particular, a criticism of the existing culture and the kind of education, and to propose toward the end what a culture would be that would meet his demands. So he's saying that modern culture, and I think this is true today as well, is driven by the moneymakers, right?
Yeah.
Greed of the state for self-preservation and self-deception of most people, that people never look inside of themselves and present themselves in what he says are beautiful forms, so that the outward appearance is much more important to culture generally than the inward appearance or the inward truth of the matter. And the greed of the sciences and men of learning. And again, I think that's it's almost dramatic criticism at the end, because especially scholars, Kant didn't live a philosophical life. And Kant was really, here's part of what I think goes on. I'm not sure how familiar many of you are with philosophy generally, and especially in universities, but even today, a philosopher will write a book, and like John Rawls wrote A Theory of Justice. And then decades of criticism go on, arguing with what Rawls has said in the book. Nobody is applying this to actually living a life. Rawls imagined an imaginary scenario of what justice might be. It couldn't be lived. It couldn't. It was impossible, but it was just a thought experiment that he ran. And then they all argued over the thought experiment, and nobody was really digging into what is life all about? What is the truth of myself am I an authentic human being? This will take place in existentialism later on, and be inspirational at that level. And this is what he's criticizing. And I was involved in the animal rights movement once upon a time, and there were a couple of, Peter Singer was a philosopher who proposed a lot of interesting things. And I don't know where Singer would be in Nietzsche's hierarchy. And Tom Regan was another one, and they actually published books advocating a certain level of rights for animals. And there was so much criticism that came over words that were being used. It was just useless ways to write a book and ways to think about this book somebody else had written. And a lot of academic philosophy is exactly that. It's people chasing their tail. And Kant in particular, they've been arguing over Kant for what, 250 years or whatever it is. I'm not sure how long it's been. And they're still doing it. Richard Rorty is a wonderful example of a modern philosopher who realized that scholastic philosophy was empty. And he quit. He quit being a philosopher and became a teacher, a lecturer, or a professor of literature. He stopped doing philosophy, and he was right down the hall from Rawls. And the reason he did that was because he realized he didn't give Nietzsche any credit. But what Nietzsche was writing here is what Rawls recognized to be true on his own, or maybe it was Nietzsche as a backdrop. I'm not really sure. Jason.
Well, I think what you said is very, how shall I say, surprise to me, or I shall call it enlightening to me, because I probably read all Nietzsche wrong if you are right. Okay, that means yeah, it could be you are wrong and I'm right, so that's also possible. But if you are right, then I probably read very wrong. So according to your understanding of Nietzsche, Kant is not a philosopher because he doesn't live a philosophical life. He just corner himself and then write the book which people read till today. Okay, so it doesn't make much sense. So that's why he is talking about, I think, so that's how connect with the talking about the Rousseauian man, Goethean man, and the Schopenhauerian man. Okay, but unfortunately, I am opposite to Nietzsche. I just read. I don't care how these people live. Okay, so I think that's important. They probably will help me understand what how to read Nietzsche.
Oh, good. That's great. I don't know if you can.
Because I've been struggling, especially this one, this reading. Of course, I have to admit, I read in rush because I missed the previous section. So I kind of skip, and then I find out it's very difficult to understand on this one. The Birth of Tragedy, I can get it. That's not that difficult. But this one, to me, is very difficult. So probably my presumption was wrong. Okay, so I do expect to read some his understanding of Schopenhauer, which I didn't get anything. And when I say Schopenhauer, I mean the book called The World as a Will and the Representation, which he didn't mention at all. That's
yeah. It's in fact the only mention of his writings is another paper on criticizing the university. So, but Nietzsche, like I said, had his own experience at the university. So he knew whereof he spoke. And he's setting an example of the kind of honesty. And that's why these were called untimely meditations, because people weren't doing this. They were celebrating the university, and they still do today. But he's sort of he doesn't say this, but it seems like there's a suggestion that philosophy can't be taught. You have to have a philosophical bent to begin with to be a philosopher. So a philosopher is like like Rorty, what I said about Rorty, I don't think he would put him up there with Schopenhauer, but you know, I'm not really sure either. And Rousseau lived an active life that expressed his philosophy of the social contract. And Goethe lived large as an artist. And Schopenhauer was independent of the university, and he thought this is everything a philosopher ought to be. And in addition to being philosophical, you have to have those thoughts. And Kant was just a terrible example because he critique of pure reason is borderline incomprehensible in one reading. You almost have to go over it again or read some kind of criticism that clarifies a lot of it. And this style of writing, because Kant did propose something altogether new about the metaphysical state of the world, and his observation about space and time and causality are built into our brains. They're not something that can be demonstrated and proven. And that was a pretty startling statement. So it's not that Kant didn't think thoughts that were worth paying attention to, but as a philosopher, Kant did not. He did the same. He had and this is a famous observation about Kant. You could set your watch by the time of day that he did things. He was absolutely punctual every day. He had breakfast at a certain time. He left to go to his classes at a certain time. His life was rigidly blocked in. And so it wasn't really a life at all. And he set an example for a lot of future philosophers who thought they had to write the same way he did. That, I think, Nietzsche finds confusing. Although I have to say that I could criticize this essay on a lot of grounds for repetition and even birth of tragedy. And a lack of definition necessarily of actually talking about, because he doesn't really get into Schopenhauer's philosophy. So it's hard to think, what is it about what Schopenhauer said that means so much to Nietzsche that he can be called a philosopher? So there's a lot of blank spaces in there for thought. And I think that's a fair criticism to make. And I think that there's going to be a turn to aphorisms after we do the next one, his meditation on history. And then we're going to be into the aphoristic style. And I think the aphoristic style appealed to him because he could concentrate all of his thought into one space, one small space, and just put a thought and an observation out there. And then move on to something else instead of trying to develop from beginning to end a thesis of some sort. So the thesis here at excessive length, and the bitterness he must have held toward the university, I think, is profound, because that is a really angry attack in section 8. Maybe bitterness is the wrong word, but contempt. I think that's the more appropriate word, contempt. Eva.
That works for me. I'm wondering if I read this correctly. It seems to me that he's putting the Buddhist and the Christian mythologies in the same boat with Kant as far as philosophy goes. Is that what he's saying here, or am I misreading this?
No, I don't think you're misreading it. I'm not sure about the Buddhistic part of it, but Kant's conclusion was religious in nature, especially down the road. The nominal world, which is where the concepts of space-time causality are. When he gets to the metaphysics of morality, God is a very important player in that. What Kant did, though, was demonstrate that you can't prove reasonably And that was the critique of pure reason, right? You couldn't prove with a reasonable argument that God actually existed. And so he attacks the classical argument that demonstrates how they're just full of holes and don't work at all, and then concludes you cannot. So you have to have a leap of faith, if you will.
Yeah.
Even though that's Kierkegaard, but Kant was raised in the Christian tradition and was probably a Lutheran himself or something. And but
Well, he calls them mythologies. He doesn't even, in this section, he doesn't call them religions. He calls them mythologies. Buddhist and Christian. Yeah.
Yeah. Read the. Have you got it in front of you? Can you read the?
I do. It's in section 7, and let's see. Well, let me see where it starts. Everything that he gained, and he's talking, I guess, Schopenhauer here, later from life and books, no, from all the realms of knowledge was only a means of color and expression to him. The Kantian philosophy itself was to him an extraordinary rhetorical instrument for making the utterance of his vision, as he thought, clearer. The Buddhist and Christian mythologies occasionally served the same end. He had one task and 1,000 means to execute it, one meaning and innumerable hieroglyphs to express it.
Oh, this
And
is
that was in Schopenhauer.
Writing about Schopenhauer there, right?
Okay. Well, but is he tying Schopenhauer and Kant together then?
Or... No. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I'm understanding that. So, geez,
this is like this is in section 7, the next to the last paragraph of section 7, the end of that. Do you see it?
Here he criticized, I think he also criticized Schopenhauer. He talked about Schopenhauer isolation, despair of truth, and what's the third one? Yes, the 3 things I remember. So
means of expression. He joined.
Oh, okay.
Rhetorical instrument.
Hardening. He used the word hardening, limited by his own uniqueness, genius. I think he's talking about this thing.
Yeah. That's a good criticism of Kant, and that's what I sort of about how he's almost impenetrable at first.
So, hold on. This one is he criticized Schopenhauer or Kant?
No, it's Kant. He's criticizing.
Oh, so he's not talking about Schopenhauer. He's talking about Kant.
Well, he's trying to show that Kant is such a bad example. Kant was held up as by almost.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay,
thank you.
Kant was held up as the philosopher of the time, and he's trying to puncture that picture and show that Kant only had one real idea, and he found 10,000 ways to express that idea.
Oh, okay.
Got it. Yeah.
Oh, so sorry. Let me interrupt you. So I think that's important. I probably totally read it the wrong way. Okay. So this paragraph, he is complaining. Okay. So I think in the chapter 2, he praised Schopenhauer, right? He talked about his honesty, his cheerfulness, he has a strength, something like this. I remember in chapter 2. And here in chapter 7, okay, he's talking about Kant, who is isolation. He is despair of truth. I believe he talking about his antinomies. And he is kind of, I forget his word, hardening, kind of like think himself to as a genius or something like this. So, okay. So this one is Kant, not Schopenhauer.
Yeah. At the end of the very last sentence I highlighted here of section 7, of all the offense Schopenhauer has given to numerous scholars, nothing has offended them more than the unfortunate fact that he does not resemble them. And this is another criticism of the whole academic atmosphere. You have to toe the line. You can't be a rebel.
Yeah.
Schopenhauer could be a rebel. Schopenhauer could just start fresh and just ignore everything everybody said and build a whole metaphysical space for the world and explain how things worked in this space and live a life separate from scholarship. And I don't think he was really ignored quite as much as Nietzsche is claiming here, but maybe he was. Later on, I mean, we know who Schopenhauer is now, and maybe because Nietzsche liked him. I'm not really sure. But Schopenhauer's philosophical standing is in the philosophical community. But in a lot of ways, it doesn't make any difference anyway, because all they're going to do is criticize Schopenhauer's work. And now they have no reason to go, oh man, you can't be a scholar because you're out of the university. And that's the attitude that he's condemning. The university, you're not a philosopher because you teach philosophy at a university. You're a philosopher, philosophize and live philosophy. And again, this is not explained in any great detail. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to find out as we move along what that means. Right now, it's a bit of a puzzle. Jason.
Okay, so usually when I read philosophy, I don't read or don't care much about the philosopher's life. Okay, so according to Nietzsche, I was wrong. Okay, so does Schopenhauer being a professor in university?
No, never.
Oh, never. I know he was kind of at that time. Hegel is popular.
Yeah,
Is a famous professor. Okay,
and
so
again, yeah.
okay, so right now I understand because I really puzzled on how he talking about Rousseau, Gusser, and Schopenhauer, and
Yeah.
then okay, so I just have to admit I I read it totally in the wrong way, because
Well,
when the person, I think about the book, I didn't think about the person.
Yeah. I think that you're making a good observation here in a lot of ways, because Nietzsche, he was just discounted as a philosopher for decades. And then they finally began to realize that he was a philosopher. He just opened up all kinds of approaches to life and living, and we'll see how this goes on. And I think I know Bertrand Russell, for example, didn't think very much of Nietzsche at all. And we'll see what you think along the way. I'm kind of wishing we had a few more people here, because after
I'm not sure if because I read Bertrand Russell from the beginning to the end. Okay,
yeah,
so
yeah.
So that's I know the person's life. So there will be totally mismatched. Bertrand Russell said, Rousseau, okay, had 6 kids and sent them to orphanage, and they never care about his children. Okay, Bertrand Russell also criticized Schopenhauer is greedy or nasty. He will even want to file lawsuit to an old lady. So, but in other way,
Yeah.
Nietzsche praised them. Okay, so that's what I read in Bertrand Russell. I think that's totally different opinion.
Well, Nietzsche is breaking with the opinion of his time as well. Again, untimely meditations. He is willing to, it's not like everything Rousseau did in his life was wonderful and ought to be applauded, but he was an individual who stood out from his time and lived the philosophy he was espousing, which may have been nuts to the kids, whatever. But he wrote one of the great books on education, which is Emile. And it really is. If you read that, it's absolutely amazing. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of that. That's for a criticism, but you have to approach Nietzsche as anything else but an academic philosopher. It's not that he wasn't exposed to them all, but he had a veneration for for the great men of the past, especially, and again, I think Plato was one of them. And he makes a point about in the Greek society, all of these things that I was mentioning earlier, greed of the state, money matters, and outward forms more important than inward conscience. These things were not prevalent in Athens. That's not what the culture was all about. The philosophers were revered and listened to. Not that everybody did everything that they wanted them to. And then when Plato was challenged to actually put it into practice at Syracuse, that turned out to be a nightmare. But for some of the reasons that Nietzsche might be observing here, not everyone is cut out to be this. But what Nietzsche's trying to get at is this is the natural goal of our ability to have metaphysical thoughts, to be self-reflective, to have a measure of honesty. And another one, and this he says about Schopenhauer, to stand in judgment of the existing society, which Nietzsche is pretty doing a lot of himself here. So he's taking all of that on. In 7, he says, nature needs man to perfect it. And that's the whole point. We're supposed to, our duty, if we can see it, is to produce these great men. So here's the character. This is the very second sentence of, or actually part of the first sentence of section 8. These then are some of the conditions under which the philosophical genius can at any rate come into existence in our time, despite the forces working against it. Free manliness of character, early knowledge of mankind, no scholarly education, no narrow patriotism, no necessity for breadwinning, no ties with the state. In short, freedom and again, freedom, that wonderful and perilous element in which the Greek philosophers were able to grow up. Whoever wants to reproach him, as Niebuhr reproached Plato, with being a bad citizen, let him do so and be a good citizen himself. Thus, he will be in the right, and so will Plato. And this is a really good example of Nietzsche's willingness to accept the contradiction without condemning one side of it. He's going both. If you think that being a good citizen is what you should do, then go do that, and you'll be doing the right thing for yourself. But if Plato says this is all a big piggy mouse and we ought to do it this way, he is right as well. And that's one example. There's another example a little bit further on. Here too, let me see if I can find one more thing.
I didn't know who this Niebuhr was. I don't know that name.
Who cares? He was a critic.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The promotion of philosophy nowadays consists, it seems, only in the states enabling a number of men to live from their philosophy by making of it a means of livelihood. That is totally true. The academy is filled with philosophers who are just doing it for a living. They're not philosophizing at all. If whatever the papers they write are just going to be criticisms of a sentence or a word that some other philosopher wrote. If, however, a man should arise who really gave the impression of intending to apply the scalpel of truth to all things, including the body of the state, then the state would, since it affirms its own existence before all else, be justified in expelling such a man and treating him as an enemy. Again, this is contradictory. These don't seem to go together, but they do go together. And this will sneak into a lot of what's coming down the road. Can a philosopher really undertake with a good conscience to have something to teach every day and to teach it to anyone who cares to listen? Will he not be obliged to give the impression of knowing more than he does know? I do that all the time. I give the impression that I know more than I actually know. That's how it feels sometimes, anyway. Anyway, this is I think this is just rich in a lot of these little slivers of observations that are popping out.
Mm.
See if I can get one more here. But granted
Well,
that
I'm trying to decide whether I agree with him or not about, I mean, people have to make a living.
yeah, well,
And
I
you
know,
know, some of these things are kind of unrealistic.
they're only unrealistic in the culture we live in.
Okay. All right.
You know, he's dreaming big. There's no doubt about that. But what
Okay.
he's trying to say is, okay, look, I think that the culture we have sucks because we're not going to be able to produce these kinds of people. Here's what we need to do, but without being able to identify them when they're children or something. But at the moment when some artistic genius or whatever shows up and is somehow recognized, he doesn't say how that happens either, then you nurture this person. You make it so they don't have to work for a living. You encourage them. That's where he wants to see culture go. He knows it's not going to happen. Untimely again, right? Jason, last word, then we're going to wrap here.
Yeah, I just want to say to Geneva, to reading Nietzsche has nothing to agree or disagree, because he probably want you to disagree. So, so your disagree is agree. So
yeah, well, here, this thing I've got over me, I was going to mention this a little bit earlier, a very popular error, having the courage of one's conviction. Rather, courage is having the strength for an attack on one's convictions.
Yeah.
I think I have used this all my life to test what I believe. And
that's a good one. Yeah.
When I throw stuff out there, it's like I've thought a lot, not a lot of this. Well, I have thought a lot of it through. And this is my rule. So if you read something he's saying, it may challenge your conviction, but challenge your conviction and see if it holds up. Then Nietzsche's wrong. Move on. You know?
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, me too. That's why it's up there.
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys for being here today. Thank you, a couple of you, for contributing and having your video on, which I always like. And I'll be posting the next one no later than tomorrow, probably tonight. All I've got to do is change the picture on it. So we're going to be reading. Wait, let me find it here, because I've got it wrong in the.
yeah, I think that's important, because Geneva read the wrong one. I'm also,
I know I keep reading the wrong stuff.
I almost, because you know, Lindsay, I think you are very familiar with all the texts. So you just say it's obvious. But to me, for example, I struggle for a while to figure out, okay, untimely medication has 4 chapters. And the chapter 3 is Schopenhauer as educator. So it take me a while. So I start to reading on the first one. I thought that's the chapter 1. So, you know, so it's for us, it's not that familiar with Nietzsche. It's very difficult.
Well, I changed the format a little bit, and I've identified what we're doing. And what we're going to be doing next time is, and let me explain that again. Hold on, let me get it up here. On the uses and disadvantages of history for life. And I've got the wrong title down below. I have on the use and abuse of history. So, and because of the link, I may change that, I may not change that. But I did specify in the body of the meetup that is what we're reading in Untimely Meditation. So maybe I
Okay.
should. Okay, so hopefully we'll all get to that. Geneva, you're ahead of us already because that's what you read.
I, yeah,
Yeah.
I keep reading the wrong stuff. I don't know what's wrong with me, but okay.
Well,
Yeah.
it's be the right stuff next time because you've already read it. So it's section 1 through 5 of on the uses and disadvantages of history for life. And I'm going to suppose you're all using the Untimely Meditation link that I have down below. And it's the second essay in the book because there aren't very many translations available. And the one that I provided for the Cambridge edition is by far the best one. It's R.J. Hollingdale as the translator. And he and Kevin were very familiar with each other's work and respected one another's work. So, and like, I don't know if there's another one around anywhere.
So we are reading the Salt Out of Season?
Nope, not that. Nope. I don't know where you're looking. Did you click on Untimely Meditations?
Uh-huh. Untimely meditation, yes. That's
Yeah,
a PDF
it
link.
says download PDF, and then
Yes.
that's Cambridge text in the history of philosophy. That's the one to read.
Okay, history of philosophy.
The thoughts out of season is another way of translating exactly the same phrase. Yeah, this may be more. What have I got from this one here on the use and abuse of history? Oh, that's it. That's the thoughts out of season. That's the Project Gutenberg thing. Well, you can use that too.
Okay.
I'm going to change this to encourage people to use the Untimely Meditations from academia.
Okay, that'll be good. Yeah.
That's it's a much better version. Thoughts out of season is really old, and it's probably going to work either way.
Well, that's going to be funny considering what Nietzsche just said about academia.
Yeah, Nietzsche
Okay.
is talking. He's just another philosopher along the way, and I take it much more seriously than that myself. So
Okay. Okie dokie.
okay, I will modify
that's-
that. Make it
Okay, so
clearer.
I will see the meetup page to know. Okay.
I
All
may
right.
I may take those other two links down and just use Untimely Meditations and identify it as from Untimely Meditations. So, all right.
Okay.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope I see you next week on time.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Thanks for the
Meetup
lecture.
kicked me out. Yeah, and then I had to put in a new password and all kinds of crap.
They'll
So
start at 10 minutes to 3.
yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, you guys.
All right.